In the early hours of September 5th, 1932, Hollywood was confronted with a mystery that still haunts its golden age. Paul Bern, a prominent Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer producer and the newlywed husband of platinum blonde film star Jean Harlow, was found dead in his Beverly Hills home. At his bedside lay a strange note addressed to Harlow, reading in part, "This is the only way to make good the frightful wrong I have done you. You understand that last night was only a comedy." The coroner hastily ruled Bern's death as non-suspicious, but the circumstances were anything but straightforward. In the days that followed, revelations of a secret wife and alleged studio cover-ups would transform a private tragedy into one of Hollywood's earliest and greatest scandals. A case some said of a convenient whitewash to protect the era's brightest star. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. It all began a long, long way from Hollywood. Paul Bern was born Paul Levy on December 3, 1889, in the town of Wandsbek in northern Germany. He was one of 6 children in a Jewish family that owned a candy store, which was something of a dream for the 6 Bern children. However, this sweet life turned sour, and the family immigrated to New York in 1898 amid rising anti-Semitism and economic hardship in their homeland. Growing up in America, young Paul showed an early fascination with the arts, and his parents encouraged him. Paul was devastated when his father passed away in 1908, and his mother, Henrietta, now had to raise the large family alone. Paul pursued acting and studied at the prestigious American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York. In those years, he also adopted the stage name Paul Bern, a succinct Americanized moniker that he likely hoped would improve his chances in a business where ethnic prejudice still lingered. Bern soon discovered that his talents lay not in performing, but in working behind the scenes. He had little success as an actor, and by the late 1910s, he had shifted to stage management on Broadway. There, he honed the organizational and creative skills that would later serve him well in Hollywood. While performing in a Toronto stock theater company, he fell in love with a young actress of French origin named Dorothy Millette, who was a fellow actor in the troupe. The two met around 1911 and were inseparable. In fact, they married, at least informally, and moved to New York City so that Bern could pursue a career in stage management on Broadway. For several years, they lived together as husband and wife in all but name. The reason the marriage was common law rather than formally declared was that Paul's mother was extremely opposed to the relationship. It might be reasonable to assume that she was trying to protect her son from a wife who had already displayed signs of mental illness. However, Paul was Henrietta's favorite son, and her attachment to him was, to say the least, intense. The thought of Paul being with any woman at all was enough to drive Henrietta to despair, as well as frenzied outbursts directed at Paul. If Paul had hoped she might get used to the idea over time, he was very much and very tragically mistaken. Around 1920, Henrietta Levy found herself, and many who knew the family claimed she did this to try and spite her son, and as a last desperate attempt to ensure his marriage would fail and that he would remain devoted to his mother only. This tragic and deeply unsettling event hit Paul hard, but he remained firm and he was, at least now, free to marry Dorothy. However, soon after their marriage, Paul was in for more pain. Millette's mental health took a sharp turn for the worse, and she was eventually committed to a sanitarium in Connecticut after being declared a danger to herself. The twin heartbreaks of his mother's side and his separation from Dorothy would cast a long shadow over Bern's life. Paul decided a change was needed, so he headed west to California where he planned to set himself up in the movie business. In Hollywood, Paul Bern thrived. He arrived in the early 1920s just as the motion picture business was booming, and found work as a film editor before rising to screenwriter and director for studios like United Artists and Paramount. He made his directorial debut with 1922's Head Over Heels, a Mabel Normand comedy which can still be seen today. He followed up a couple of years later with Open All Night, which starred Raymond Griffith, Viola Dana, and the extraordinary Jetta Goodall, and made 2 more films in 1925 collaborating with major figures like Howard Hawks. His competence and quiet charisma caught the attention of MGM's production chief Irving Thalberg, the studio's famed boy wonder who brought Bern into MGM's stable of talent. By the late 1920s, Bern had risen to become Thalberg's right-hand man and an influential producer in his own right. His first production credit was 1929's Geraldine, a romantic comedy starring Marion Nixon, and he produced 3 more major pictures for MGM over the next couple of years. This success meant he was now operating at the heart of MGM, then very much Hollywood's most prestigious studio where the pressures to deliver star-making pictures were immense. MGM's publicity flax proudly proclaimed the studio had more stars than there are in heaven, and part of Bern's job was to shepherd those stars' projects to success. So Bern's career was reaching its zenith by 1930, but his personal life remained complicated and lonely. That, however, was all about to change. On the eve of a new decade, fate introduced Paul Bern to the woman who would define the final chapter of his life, a rising star named Jean Harlow. Even as his career flourished, Bern earned a reputation as a gentle, cultured figure in the frenetic movie colony. He stood apart from the hard-partying Hollywood crowd. While other moguls drank and danced at the Coconut Grove, Bern was more likely to host a sophisticated supper at home, discussing literature or philosophy. He also displayed a well-documented generous streak towards friends and colleagues, helping many in need. In the mid-1920s, he became devoted to actress Barbara Lamar, known as the girl who was too beautiful for her own good, whose wild lifestyle and drug addiction were leading her to an early grave. If you want to hear more about Barbara's deeply tragic story, I have a video all about her which I'll link on screen now. Paul fell deeply in love with Lamar, though she did not reciprocate his feelings. He remained one of her closest friends and supporters, reportedly paying for her expensive medical care as her health declined dramatically. In January 1926, Paul was at Lamar's bedside when she died at age 29, and he took responsibility for her funeral arrangements. He even agreed to be godfather to her young son, Don. Paul seemed to have a bottomless compassionate side, especially when it came to troubled young women. He was so caring that people began to suspect other motives. In fact, years later, Don Gallery would speculate that Bern had been his biological father. But this rumor was debunked by DNA testing. It turns out that the relationship between Paul and Barbara truly was platonic, but it was still one that added to the mystique surrounding Bern's private life. Through all of this, Paul never forgot Dorothy Millette back east. Despite their long separation, he continued to support Dorothy financially and emotionally. He sent her a monthly stipend of $350, over $5,000 in today's money, and he kept up a correspondence on branded MGM stationery. In his letters, Paul always expressed concern for Dorothy's well-being, and even encouraged her when, in mid-1932, she mentioned taking a trip to California for a change of scenery. "If you do go, I hope that it will be a happy change," he wrote to her, signing off with, "My love and best wishes always." However, both his marriage and his infatuation with Barbara Lamar would pale in comparison to the peroxide whirlwind that entered his life in the form of Jean Harlow. Harlow, just 19 at the time, had stolen the spotlight with her breakout role in Howard Hughes's aviation epic Hell's Angels in 1930. The movie showcased her platinum blonde hair and smoldering screen presence. Virtually overnight, she became Hollywood's new it girl and sex symbol. Paul, then in his early 40s, was an unlikely suitor for such a starlet. He was bookish and physically unremarkable, with a receding hairline and a generally serious demeanor. At the time, no one could quite understand what the teenage bombshell saw in the quiet German-born executive. What Harlow saw in Paul Bern, however, was someone who believed in her when few others did. Behind Harlow's meteoric rise lay skepticism within the industry. Studio executives thought of her as a mere ornamental asset, a blonde beauty to sizzle on screen. And once she had sizzled briefly, she would likely be discarded. Jean did not agree. She believed she could act and was ready to prove her talent. Paul also saw that Jean had potential to become more than just a sex symbol, so he became one of Harlow's biggest champions. In fact, it was reportedly Bern who convinced MGM to sign her to a contract after Hell's Angels. Once MGM took her on, he then set about lobbying to get her more substantial roles. Harlow blossomed under Bern's mentorship. The two developed an affectionate friendship that soon turned into a romance. I'd like to take a brief moment here to add a reminder to all the new subscribers that I have a Patreon page for the channel. If you want to help out with keeping Hollywood mysteries on air, there are a few tiers available starting from $1 a month. The second highest tier, Hollywood Histories, gives you access to a weekly essay on some small and more obscure aspect of Hollywood's past. There are higher tiers for those of you who want to be more involved and gain early access and discounted merch, among other perks. You can check out the store for my range of exclusive shirts at the link below. And furthermore, if you don't have a Patreon account, you can get all the same benefits by clicking the join button below this video here on YouTube. In the future, I'm hoping to restructure the perks to add exclusive videos for patrons and members, as well as other benefits like a Discord and ad-free audio downloads of each episode. Those of you who sign up in advance will get all those benefits as and when they arrive. And finally, I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of our current patrons and members. It really makes all the difference. But now let's get back to Paul Bern and his dangerous marriage to Jean Harlow. By early 1932, the relationship between the mogul and the starlet was the talk of Hollywood. In June of that year, Bern, 42, and Harlow, 21, announced their engagement. The match immediately raised plenty of eyebrows in the gossip columns. Beauty in the brain, some called it. But Harlow seemed genuinely smitten with the kind, intellectual producer. It didn't fit the narrative, but here was one of the most desirable women in the world who wanted a partner who simply believed in her and treated her with seemingly endless kindness. They married in a small ceremony on July 2, 1932, with only a handful of friends and family in attendance, including Harlow's stepfather, Marino Count Bello, and screen idol John Gilbert, who served as Bern's best man. Photographs from that summer show Harlow beaming in bridal white and Bern at her side with an uncharacteristic grin, as if amazed at his own fortune. Yet beneath the newlywed smiles lurked undercurrents of tension. The pressures on the couple were enormous. Harlow's fame meant their private life was constantly under the spotlight, and Bern's role at MGM added another layer of scrutiny. Not long after the wedding, whispers began to circulate that the marriage was troubled. Some suggested that Bern felt emasculated by his wife's bombshell celebrity. Others hinted at more intimate problems, claiming that their union had not been physically consummated due to Bern's impotence, a claim that would soon become tabloid fodder. There were also complexities from Bern's past that he had kept hidden. For one, he had yet to tell Harlow about Dorothy Millette, the woman who still, in a legal sense, was his wife. As far as Hollywood society knew, Dorothy did not exist. Everyone believed Paul was a confirmed bachelor until Harlow came along. This secret weighed on him. Friends later testified that in the weeks after his marriage, Paul spoke ominously of feeling like a great mistake had been made. Telling Jean about Dorothy would be hard, but telling Dorothy about Jean might turn out to be even harder. The pressure was building and his marriage to Harlow was already suffering. On the evening of September 4th, 1932, less than 2 months into their marriage, Paul Bern and Jean Harlow parted ways after a reported minor quarrel. Harlow went to stay at her mother's house for the night, while Paul remained alone at their home, an elegant bungalow at 9820 Easton Drive in Benedict Canyon, Beverly Hills. This was ordinary enough in some sense. However, something truly extraordinary was about to happen, and a mystery for the ages would unfold. Sometime in the late night or early morning hours, a gunshot echoed through the property. By mid-morning on September 5th, the household staff discovered Paul Bern's lifeless body in the master bedroom. He had been shot in the head and a .38 caliber pistol lay on the floor beside him. A chilling note was found on a dressing table addressed to Dearest Dear, Bern's pet name for Harlow. In neat handwriting, it declared, "Unfortunately, this is the only way to make good the frightful wrong I have done you, and to wipe out my abject humiliation. I love you. You understand that last night was only a comedy." The meaning of these words was as obscure as they were haunting. What wrong had been done? What had happened on that last night that so humiliated Paul Bern? There were no obvious answers. Strangely, the first phone call the distraught servants made was not to the police. It was to MGM's front office. In the highly controlled world of 1930s Hollywood, studios often handled their stars' crises internally before involving law enforcement, and this case would prove no exception. MGM executives, including fixers from the front office, raced to the scene and arrived well before the authorities. For the next 2 hours, these studio emissaries combed through the house, removing any potentially embarrassing evidence, while Paul Bern's body remained where it lay. Precisely what was altered or taken during that interval remains a matter of speculation. In later years, Hollywood lore even suggested that Eddie Mannix, MGM's notorious fixer, oversaw this hushed cleanup operation. Whether Mannix was on the scene personally or not remains uncertain, but there can be little doubt that he would have been instrumental in managing the outcome of this shocking scene and the inevitable media circus. Some say the MGM team found personal letters and documents relating to Dorothy Millette and quietly destroyed them. Others believe they removed signs of discord that might reflect poorly on Harlow or the studio. In any case, by the time the Beverly Hills police were finally summoned, the death scene had been thoroughly sanitized to MGM's satisfaction. When Harlow was informed of her husband's death by MGM representatives, not the police, she was hysterical. Later that day, however, under studio guidance, the 22-year-old star composed herself and gave a brief, carefully coached statement to investigators. To every question about what might have transpired, Jean Harlow replied that she knew nothing. However, Harlow maintained the stance of ignorance consistently, even when called before a grand jury inquest, repeating only that she knew nothing of what might have driven her husband to this end. MGM attorneys made sure she was shielded from any further intense questioning, and indeed she never spoke publicly about the incident for the rest of her life. With the high-profile Hollywood death on their hands, the authorities moved quickly to close the case. Within days, the Los Angeles County coroner officially ruled Paul Bern's death suicide, caused by a self-inflicted gunshot wound. On September 9th, an estimated 2,000 people packed into a chapel in Inglewood Park Cemetery for Bern's funeral. Hollywood's elite turned out in force, and actor Conrad Nagel delivered a heartfelt eulogy. Jean Harlow, veiled in black, sat silently in the front row supported by her mother, while throngs of curiosity seekers waited outside. To the public, it seemed an open and shut, if tragically puzzling case. A successful producer with no evident enemies had apparently taken his own life in shame over some unnamed wrong to his famous wife. Yet almost immediately, contradictions and curiosities emerged that made observers wonder if there was more to the story. At the coroner's inquest, several of Bern's close friends testified that he had battled bouts of depression for years. Director Paul Stein recounted that Bern had spoken of suicide long before Jean Harlow entered his life. Indeed, Bern's mental state had been fragile, and the immense publicity surrounding his marriage to a sex symbol may have exacerbated his troubles. These testimonies supported the suicide theory, a narrative of a sensitive man undone by personal demons and the pressure of marrying a superstar. But other details did not fit so neatly. For example, police noted Bern's body was found in an unknown woman's robe, a fact that certainly raised some questions of whose it was and whether another person had been present. The discovery of the note with its cryptic phrasing only raised more questions. Even as Paul Bern was laid to rest, rumors were tearing through Hollywood. The press got wind of whispers that Jean Harlow's husband had led a double life. Within 48 hours of Bern's death, reporters unearthed a bombshell. Paul Bern had a secret wife. In fact, MGM's publicity machine had tried desperately to keep the lid on the story of Dorothy Millette, but by early September 1932, her name was making headlines. An insurance agent of Bern's let slip to police that the late producer had been making regular payments to a Miss Millette, and that he had never actually divorced this woman. A lawyer in New York then came forward to confirm that he had drawn up a will for Dorothy Millette more than a decade earlier, referring to her as Bern's wife. I was always under the impression that Dorothy was his wife. I believe there was some legal marriage ceremony performed, the attorney told the Associated Press. I heard somewhere that Mrs. Bern had died in a sanitarium. Bern had not mentioned her for years. Paul Bern's own sister also confirmed that Dorothy and Paul had lived as husband and wife long ago. The press swiftly dubbed Dorothy Millette the ghost wife of Paul Bern, a spectral figure from his past who had suddenly materialized at the center of the scandal. Yet Dorothy herself was nowhere to be found. As investigators pieced together her story, they learned that Millette had indeed traveled to California that summer. Since May 1932, she had been staying in San Francisco's Plaza Hotel under her maiden name. Letters discovered in her hotel suite, typed on MGM stationery, revealed a correspondence with Paul Bern that lasted right up to the time of his death. The letters reassured her that he would cover her financial needs and that she should enjoy her newfound freedom from the sanatorium as she visited California. It appeared that even as he embarked on his marriage with Harlow, Bern was trying to keep Dorothy content and at a distance, perhaps to avoid a confrontation or heartbreak. Dorothy Millette's trail grew more dramatic after Bern's death. On September 6, the day after the body was found, Dorothy heard the news broadcast on the radio in San Francisco. She immediately checked out of the Plaza Hotel, settling her bill in full for the 4 months she'd lived there. She then made her way to the waterfront and purchased a $3 ticket for an overnight riverboat called the Delta King, which traveled from San Francisco up the Sacramento River. Witnesses later recalled seeing a distraught but composed dark-haired woman aboard the vessel. A waiter remembered Dorothy dining alone that evening, barely touching her food and looking, quote, pretty but exhausted. Around 2:30 a.m., a fellow passenger out for a late stroll saw Millette on the top deck, crying as she gazed out into the inky water. She didn't even notice his presence. About 2 hours later, a night watchman making his rounds found a woman's coat and shoes carefully set on the deck, but no sign of Dorothy. When the Delta King docked that morning and Millette failed to disembark, the crew knew what had happened. On September 14, 1932, the mystery of Dorothy Millette reached its own tragic conclusion. 2 fishermen on the Sacramento River near Walnut Grove discovered a woman's body floating in the reeds. It was identified as Dorothy. The 34-year-old had drowned in apparent suicide by jumping overboard. In her purse, which had been left on the riverboat, detectives found personal letters and a news clipping about Paul Bern's death. The coroner duly ruled Dorothy's death a suicide with no sign of foul play. Tragically, investigators learned that Bern had recently changed his will to make Harlow his beneficiary in place of Dorothy. With Paul's death, Dorothy realized she had lost not only her husband, but also her financial support, leaving her virtually penniless. That despair is explanation enough for her fatal decision to slip into the dark river. Back in Los Angeles, MGM executives exhaled in relief. A potentially explosive threat to their biggest star's reputation had effectively been neutralized by fate. Still, the studio took no chances. It quietly went to work spinning the narrative to ensure Jean Harlow emerged with sympathy rather than suspicion. Friendly journalists were fed a line that cast Bern as a deeply troubled man who had taken his own due to embarrassing personal problems, while Harlow was portrayed as the innocent, heartbroken widow. Unattributed whispers from the MGM publicity department suggested that Paul Bern was, quote, biologically unsuited to marriage, a coded way of saying he suffered from impotence, and that this secret shame had driven him to suicide. This macabre knife twist on the reputation of one of their own accomplished 2 things. It shifted any hint of blame away from Jean Harlow, and it degraded Bern's masculinity enough that the public might accept that he killed himself out of humiliation. As director, Henry Hathaway, who had worked under Bern at the studio, later observed, the powers at MGM calculated that it was better to let Bern's manhood take the hit than to let Harlow's image as a goddess be tarnished. Better to paint Harlow as an innocent dupe than a participant in a scandalous bigamy. At the official inquest, Dr. Howard Jones, Paul Bern's personal physician, provided a tantalizing hint at the truth without fully divulging it. He testified that he knew exactly what had driven his friend to despair, but out of respect for Bern, he refused to state it in open court. Dr. Jones did insist on the record that the cause of Bern's turmoil had nothing to do with Dorothy Millette or any other woman. To keen observers, that was as good as confirming the impotence theory, implying that Bern's anguish stemmed from a physical condition that left him feeling inadequate as a husband. The coroner's jury accepted the narrative of suicide. In their verdict, they officially attributed Paul Bern's act to despondency and ill health, closing the case with no criminal suspicion. Though the case was officially closed, the strange death of Paul Bern continued to fascinate and disturb those who knew him. Around studio backlots and at Hollywood dinner parties, alternate theories of what really happened that night took on a life of their own. Was it truly suicide, or had Dorothy Millette played a more sinister role? Or could there have been some other twist, an accidental shooting, or even a cover-up for a different killer? One challenge to the official story came from famous screenwriter Ben Hecht. In 1960, nearly 3 decades after Bern's death, Hecht published a sensational article in Playboy magazine that reignited interest in the case. Hecht, who was already known for his nose for scandal, asserted that the suicide finding had been a lie, a suicide whitewash, he called it, engineered by MGM to protect Jean Harlow. Hecht insinuated that an unnamed woman had actually killed Paul Bern, and that MGM had cleaned up the evidence and concocted the note to save their star from scandal. It might crimp her box office allure to have her blazoned as a wife who couldn't hold her husband, Hecht wrote acidly, imagining the studio's mindset. The article caused a furor. Under public pressure, the Los Angeles County District Attorney reopened the Bern case files in 1960. However, after reviewing the old evidence to the extent any evidence remained, the DA concluded there was nothing substantial to contradict the original verdict. He dismissed Hecht's claims as, quote, a wild and unconfirmed rumor peddled as fact. The case was closed again, officially unsolved, but still presumed suicide. Then, in 1990, a new twist emerged in the form of a book by Samuel Marks, a former MGM producer who had been close to Paul Bern. In his book, Deadly Illusions, Marks recounted his own chilling experience on the morning of September 5, 1932. He claimed that he went to Bern's house very early, having been alerted unofficially by someone at MGM, and found none other than Irving Thalberg, the great producer and Bern's mentor, at the scene apparently tampering with evidence before police arrived. According to Marks, the next day, MGM's legendary studio chief, Louis B. Mayer, gathered a group of executives, Marks included, and laid down the law. Bern's death would be ruled suicide brought on by impotence, and that was the story they were all to stick to. Marks wrote that he accepted that story for years, but upon revisiting the case, he became convinced that the real scenario was this. Dorothy Millette had shown up at Bern and Harlow's home that night, confronted her former lover in a rage, and shot him dead. The studio, discovering the truth, decided to sweep away the murder of their executives as if it were his own doing. Samuel Marks concluded that Dorothy's subsequent suicide by drowning was a final act of guilt and despair after she fled the scene of her vengeance. Supporting Marks's theory, other old-timers from MGM came forward with recollections that bolstered the cover-up narrative. In this version of events, everyone at the studio colluded to depict Bern as a pathetic figure who died by his own hand over sexual inadequacy, rather than reveal that the poor man had been the victim of a deadly melodrama involving two women. Modern biographers have also weighed in, trying to separate myth from truth. E.G. Fleming, who wrote a comprehensive 2009 biography of Paul Bern, noted that over the years Bern's character was unfairly maligned by studio-spun rumors. In the aftermath of his death, pulp accounts painted Bern as a pervert, a wife-beater, even a closeted homosexual, anything to absolve Hollywood's darling Jean Harlow of blame. Fleming dismisses these depictions, describing Paul Bern instead as an educated, charming, likable, gracious man who made one tragic mistake. He misjudged the wrath of his scorned common-law wife, Dorothy Millette. In Fleming's assessment, Bern disastrously underestimated Dorothy's instability and jealousy. By marrying Harlow without severing ties to Dorothy, he walked into a deadly trap of his own making. Naturally, other wild theories have sprung up over time, from theories that Harlow's formidable mother might have killed Paul, to insinuations that Harlow herself might have asked MGM to get rid of Bern for her, so disappointed was she with her husband. Yet no credible evidence has ever emerged to support such claims, leaving them firmly in the realm of conjecture and conspiracy theory. Yet, for all the intrigue of the murder theories, many historians and writers remain unconvinced. They point out that the timeline of Dorothy Millette's movements make it difficult to conclusively place her at the crime scene. Dorothy was in San Francisco the afternoon of September 5th, hundreds of miles away, when news of Bern's death broke, meaning that if she had killed him in the wee hours of that morning in Los Angeles, she somehow managed to travel back to San Francisco almost immediately and appear calmly at her hotel, a sequence of events that strains credulity. Moreover, no witness ever definitely placed Dorothy in Los Angeles that night. On the other hand, Paul Bern's long history of depression, his morose talk in the days before his death, and Dr. Jones's guarded testimony all point toward the likelihood that Bern did indeed die by his own hand. As one retrospective article put it, the truth, though we will never know for sure, is likely much more mundane, although just as tragic. In this view, Paul Bern was a man tormented by internal demons, possibly impotence, possibly guilt over Dorothy, who saw suicide as the only escape from an emotionally untenable situation. And although it is impossible to know what he had done the night before, his mysterious words imply that whatever it was a source of shame or embarrassment to him in the immediate aftermath. The sensational elements that followed, the ghost wife and the studio cleanup, were most likely part coincidence and part public relations crisis management, rather than components of a grand murder conspiracy. Here was a man who rose from humble beginnings, an immigrant boy from Germany to the upper echelons of the glittering film industry. At the time of his death, he had just co-produced MGM's newest prestige picture, the ensemble drama Grand Hotel, which would premiere only a week later and go on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture, a triumph Bern never lived to see. But instead of being remembered for that achievement, he became a victim of misfortune and perhaps of the studio system's ruthless need to maintain appearances. Bern's name is often overshadowed by those of the two women forever linked to his fate, Jean Harlow, the legendary screen siren who was widowed by his death, and Dorothy Millette, the ghost from his past whose own tragic end bookended the saga. All three would be dead within 5 years of that fateful night, Bern in 1932, Millette just days later, and Harlow in 1937 when she succumbed to kidney failure at the age of 26. For Jean Harlow, Paul Bern's death was a trauma she carried silently. Under studio orders, she never publicly addressed the rumors or the lost promise of that brief, albeit troubled, marriage. She continued to reign as one of Hollywood's top stars for a few more years. Colleagues said she was never quite the same bubbly baby after 1932, but Harlow did her duty, entertaining audiences and upholding the glamorous illusion. She even entered into a brief remarriage in 1933, her third marriage to cameraman Harold Rawson, but it ended in divorce within a year. When she herself died prematurely, MGM shut down for a day of mourning. In a wistful footnote, Harlow was interred not beside Bern, but in a private crypt paid for by her late lover, William Powell, with whom she spent the final years of her life. As for Dorothy Millette, she was buried in a quiet cemetery in Northern California under the name Dorothy Millette Bern. Even in death, she clung to the name of the man she loved and perhaps could not live without. Over the decades, Paul Bern's story has been revisited in books, documentaries, and countless gossip columns. It endures as one of Hollywood's classic unsolved mysteries, comparable to the notorious unsolved murder of director William Desmond Taylor a decade earlier. A real-life noir from the Boulevard of Broken Dreams. If you're curious to hear my deep dive into the Taylor case, I have a video on that one and I'll link it on screen now. Nearly a century later, the ghost of Paul Bern, not to mention that of his ghost wife, still lingers in the lore of Tinseltown, a reminder that behind the sparkle of every Hollywood fairy tale may lurk secrets that fade to black unsolved, long after the final reel. That's all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider the usual trio of liking, sharing, and subscribing if you haven't already. It's what keeps the channel alive. Also, don't forget to check out the store and our range of exclusive shirts. Great gifts for any movie buffs in your life. Thanks for listening. Sweet dreams.